What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my RPG Gamer's Guide to the Holidays, talking about all of the various games that have released this year, their genres, and in general just what a lot of these games are about, to hopefully give you some ideas for the holidays, things you might want to buy, etc. Now at the beginning of the video here, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit, explain some various things we're going to be talking about, and for starters, the games in this video are things that have released this year. The beautiful thing about gaming in general is that releases are pretty much non-stop. Even from the time of this video, there's about 4 or 5 major releases left in the year, despite us really only having December left. Also, if you want more information about any of these titles individually, I have reviewed most of them. Some of the sections towards the end will be for games that have not released yet, because they are coming out in December, and a couple of games that are highly praised but I have not personally checked out, whereas most everything else on this list are games I have personal experience with, which brings me to yet another point, and that is probably the most important for a lot of people, and that is simply the price of these games. Now what I will be doing is talking about the full price of these games and whether or not they are worth buying outright or on sale, and theoretically how much you might get out of them. While I understand people would probably like information on things like various sales, where you can grab them, etc., the issue there is that I am just one guy on the internet, and with the ever increasing rise of digital sales in terms of video games, that's simply more information than I can collate. As in addition to all sorts of digital platforms selling these games for a variety of prices, including differences in regional pricing, because it's worth mentioning that this YouTube channel's reach is relatively global. About 30% of my audience is from the US, and the other 70% is from all sorts of countries all over the world. So while I tend to talk in US dollars, what that means for other countries with different currencies is very different. And I can't possibly account for every single sale on every single retailer or digital platform. Thus, we're going to be talking full price and whether or not you should pick it up on sale or if it's worth its asking price. And last but not least, before we jump into this, we're going to be covering, of course, the platforms these games are available on, as well as how friendly they are to newcomers versus veterans. With no further ado, we're going to jump into the category of RPG that saw the most releases this year, really, and that is the tactical RPG. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as SRPGs, tactical or strategy, but these are largely the same kinds of games. These games often focus on tactical and strategic combat, usually in turn-based arenas of some sort, that see you building up a team of heroes or characters and tackling various combat encounters, all while playing along in a story. And first up in this category, we have Expeditions Rome. Expeditions Rome is a alternative history Roman Empire story. More specifically, we play as a stand-in for Julius Caesar. In this game, the actual Julius Caesar dies much earlier than he did in real life, and we take up his role, where we will navigate the major conflicts he saw in his lifetime and choose potentially to either follow his route or make various choices that will of course lead to different outcomes. And while this does obviously have some correlation with real-world history, it does have a sort of fantastical edge to a lot of it. While tactical RPGs tend to lean more on the combat itself, Expeditions Rome has a ton of choices and potential outcomes based on the decisions you make as well. This game is relatively easy to get into. It has a variety of difficulty levels, so it can be fairly newcomer friendly or relatively challenging for veterans on the higher difficulties. Playtime is generally going to run you around 30 to 40 hours for a playthrough, and this particular game is available on PC specifically, and full price runs you about $45. This is a game that I think is very much so worth that price, and can certainly give you a lot of fun. Next up, we have King Arthur: A Knight's Tale. This is a grim, dark, grittier version of Arthurian legend, with, of course, heavy emphasis on tactical turn-based combat. However, we will also be managing our version of Camelot, seeing the upkeep of our team of knights as we take on the role of Sir Mordred. Now, the most important things to know about this one in particular are that, again, it's a sort of darker, grittier version of normal Arthurian legend. This is not a game that I would really buy for young children. There's a little bit of nudity, and the difficulty of the game itself is a bit higher than what is normal for these games. There are also a lot of difficulty spikes here and there that can be difficult to overcome, and the game also isn't in its final state yet either. While it is released, they are still working on it, adding content to the in-game. There's DLC to come, and in its current state, combined with the difficulty problems and honestly just slightly higher barrier to entry overall. For most people, this one's going to be a buy on sale, though it will give you around 30 to 40 hours of playtime, potentially more depending on how you want to lean into the seasons of combat that are available after the game is over, so potentially much more than that, though the audience for a game like this is a tiny bit niche, and while it is available on PS5, Xbox Series X and S, as well as PC, it's nonetheless a buy on sale from me. And then we have Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, which is an absolute mouthful of a title, but this game sees us taking control of the Grey Knights in the Warhammer 40k universe as they fight to stop the spread of corruption and demons from the warp. We will be managing our teams of Grey Knights from aboard our ship, the Baleful Edict, as we travel around a sector of space and attempt to stop the spread of plague and corruption. Now, the nice thing about this particular tactical RPG is that it's relatively easy to get into. Some of the higher difficulties are, of course, rather challenging, but overall, the systems at play here are relatively simple in comparison to tactical RPGs at large. And while there can be a decent amount of learning curve, this is a game that is easier than most of this particular genre to jump into, especially if you're playing on normal or below. It has an average runtime of roughly 30 to 40 hours, depending on how you're playing, and there is more content being worked on currently. They also recently released an update for this one. However, it is only available on PC for $45 at full price. This is a game that does justify that price tag. If you can buy it on sale, even better, but it's very much so worth the money. Though it's probably worth mentioning, as I'm sure you've seen on screen, Warhammer 40k abides by the rule of cool. It's very over the top with its gore and systems, though in a way that tends to come off a little on the cartoonish side. And then we have Hard West 2. Hard West 2 is of course the sequel to Hard West, and in this particular universe, we play in a sort of supernatural Wild West, where we take on a team of cowboys who are trying to get their souls back from a demon who beat them in poker. While this particular game, like all the others, is of course a tactical turn-based game, it uses what I like to refer to as puzzle tactics. This particular genre of game across the board tends to have a sort of puzzle-esque element to it, where a lot of it comes down to using the right weapons and taking the right actions at the appropriate time. In games like Hard West 2, where the system is a little simpler overall, a lot of the combat encounters feel like puzzles where you need to use this character to use this move and that kind of thing. And on lower difficulties, there are obviously more solutions, as opposed to higher difficulties where it's more difficult to do it in the exact way you need to. And just because of that, it's not exactly going to be everybody's cup of tea. But it does have a fun cast of colorful characters and an interesting story with a world map and side quests to explore here and there, and a tiny bit of choice and consequence, as well as a relatively simple combat system to jump into, albeit one that can be a little difficult to master. A playthrough of Hard West 2 is probably going to run you 20 to 30 hours, and you can buy it on PC only for $30. Personally, I enjoyed the game, and I think it was worth that asking price. And then we have Circus Electrique, an incredibly interesting turn-based game meets circus sim. We play in London in an alternative history where steampunk technology has come a long way. However, the city of London has been overrun by the vicious, people who are being driven crazy by said technology and are attacking you. You play as, of course, a circus manager. So in addition to managing your circus and putting on shows, you have to use your circus performers in turn-based combat to navigate your way through the city of London to put a stop to the vicious and whatever is causing them. Overall, a fun game with a very fun vibe to the whole thing. However, the difficulty of this game really depends on your difficulty settings. Normal can be quite challenging towards the end, with the higher difficulties being a challenge for most people. However, if you're playing it on the lower difficulties, it can just be a fun experience for people, especially younger kids or people unfamiliar with the genre, and combined with its price tag of only $20, which is available on most every platform, and you have a game that's very easy to recommend because it's relatively cheap and easy to acquire on basically any hardware that you have. And that brings us to the Diofield Chronicle, an anomaly as far as tactical RPGs go, as it is in fact real-time with pause. This means the action is not turn-based, but rather happening all at once. In Diofield, we take on the role of mercenaries who are aiming to defend a kingdom from a looming war, which sees us participating in various missions and battles throughout a variety of chapters. The story itself is relatively linear, with the big emphasis being on the combat and missions. While this game is gorgeous, it is relatively easy easy as far as these games go. It doesn't provide much of a challenge, which does make it a relatively approachable starting point for a lot of people. It's also only going to run you about 15 hours, and it is available on most platforms. The only real problem with Diofield is its asking price of a full $60. This is pretty much standard AAA game price, and the issue here is there's just not enough content to back it up. The game itself is probably going to run you about 15 hours, and even on the harder difficulties, it's relatively easy to play, so you're unlikely to get a lot of replay value out of it. And for these reasons, while it can be fun overall, especially if you like the art style and the combat, it's a game that I would recommend a deep sale for. Something in the $20 to $30 range before I personally would buy it. And then next up we have Lost Eidolons, another game where we take up the role of mercenaries who are trying to stave off a looming war, but ultimately get dragged into it. Lost Eidolons, however, is relatively low fantasy. There are some fantasy elements that start to pick up later in the title, but most of the game has a slightly grittier medieval feel to it outside of the occasional use of magic. If you're familiar with the Fire Emblem series of games, you'll be relatively at home in Lost Eidolons, as it takes a lot from that particular series. And while this game certainly can be difficult, especially if you're unfamiliar with these types of games, a decent amount of difficulty settings does make it more approachable than it might initially seem, and the game itself is likely to run you about 40 or so hours. It's available on PC for $35, and for me, it is definitely a buy. Again, if you can get it on sale for the holidays, even better, but its full asking price I do think is worth it. Though the game itself can be a little heavy on the story, those story scenes can be skipped, which will keep you in the combat sections of the game, and this is a game with developers who are quite dedicated to improving upon it, and it has already seen multiple updates which bring it more in line with community requests, which is always nice to see. And then we have Triangle Strategy. Triangle Strategy originally released earlier this year back on the Switch, however, it recently saw a PC release as well. This is a game that uses what are called HD 2D graphics, which is this sort of modernized pixel art that you see, of course, on screen. And while this is, like most TRPGs, a game with heavy emphasis on tactical turn-based combat, it is very, very heavy on the story as well, especially on a first playthrough of the game. So if you don't like games with a heavy emphasis on story versus combat, this one might not be for you. And in fact, a lot of your enjoyment of Triangle Strategy really is going to depend on how many times you play through the game and whether or not you like the story, as there are multiple ways to go through the story, which can be seen and played through on New Game Plus. New Game Plus is where a lot of the extra combat and various encounters can be undertaken via a camp system that will let you partake in optional battles, and subsequent playthroughs also allow you to upgrade more of your units a little more freely than the initial run will. And while one playthrough of the game might be 20 to 30 hours, give or take, multiple playthroughs can easily give you about 100 hours worth of playtime. Those factors make Triangle Strategy a little difficult to give a good consensus on. Personally, I would say for most people, it's probably going to be a buy on sale, especially with its full asking price of $60. Though with the holidays, you can potentially get this one on sale, which would make it a great deal. And then next up, we have the recent released Tactics Ogre. Tactics Ogre is one of the crown jewels, as they like to call it, of the TRPG genre. That said though, Tactics Ogre is a bit on the difficult side. It does not have difficulty options, so you don't really have any choice but to approach what the game has to offer, and a single run through is going to give you about 40 hours worth of playtime. Now, it's worth mentioning that we are specifically talking about Tactics Ogre Reborn. This is a remake of a 1995 release, which is a sort of cult classic for people who like these kinds of games. While Tactics Ogre Reborn makes a ton of improvements to make this game more approachable overall, it's definitely a game that is better off if you have some experience with these types of games, and it's not a game I would recommend you start looking into this genre with, but it definitely does have a lot to enjoy with easily hundreds of hours worth of content, though a single run is going to be about 40 hours give or take. It also has a variety of endings, though that said, the story here is a relatively bleak story about war, vengeance, retribution, whatever you want to call it, and that combined with the difficulty means I would probably take a look at some of the content before I let a younger child play this, though teenagers would almost certainly be fine. But the game itself is available for $50 on PlayStation, Nintendo Switch, and PC. For me, it's a buy, provided you like this kind of game. This just released recently, so I think it's unlikely we'll see a big sale on this for the holidays, but even at its full price, I do think it's worth the money. Provided, of course, you like the genre. Now, last up on this list, we have Sunday Gold. While I would argue this one isn't exactly a TRPG, it is a turn-based game with some very difficult boss fights that rely on tactics, so I decided to throw it in with this particular genre anyway. Sunday Gold takes place in a dystopian future where we play as 3 criminals, one of which who was recently fired from a big corporation that specializes in cyber dogfights. As you investigate this company and try to help, obviously things spiral out of control. This game plays a lot like a point-and-click adventure, so if you're familiar with games like Monkey Island and you liked games like that, you'll probably like this to some degree, albeit with a slightly more mature theme to it. However, we of course have turn-based combat. While the normal encounters can be relatively straightforward, boss fights in this particular game, while there's only a handful of them, are relatively difficult and require a very specific approach. So there's an element of strategy to that in particular. And while thankfully, due to the game's relatively short runtime, this is hardly impossible to overcome, I think it is worth knowing if you plan on buying it. The game itself is available on PC for $22 and it's going to run you about 10 hours or so. Doing everything the game had to offer was about a 12-hour experience for me, and for its relatively cheap asking price, I do think it's worth a buy. However, it is a bit of a unique game as far as these kinds of games go. It's relatively niche, so this one honestly just might not be for everybody, but if you decide to check it out, I do think it's pretty cool. Now, that brings us to our next genre, and that is the Soulslikes. Soulslikes are interesting. Some of them are easy and they just incorporate Soulslikes mechanics. Others are fairly difficult and punishing. These games tend to have a very big emphasis on the ebb and flow of combat, defending yourself against enemy attacks, waiting for an opening, and then punishing enemies when they open themselves up to attack, as well as building a character often around obscure mechanics that aren't necessarily fully explained. As such, these games are not for everyone, but the people who love them really love them. And the year 2022 did see the release of a few different ones. Now, the first that we're going to talk about is arguably the most interesting, and it is actually Tunic. This is an isometric take on a Souls-like, which is interesting. It's definitely unique in that regard. And while the graphics might make you think this is for kids, given the relatively difficult combat for a game like this, along with the very puzzle-oriented nature of the game, this isn't a game I would give to young kids purely based on the difficulty alone. But if you're familiar with the old Zelda adventure games on various handheld consoles, this plays very similarly to that, but with more difficult combat encounters. A lot of the game's puzzles and mechanics are presented through pages of a manual you'll be picking up as you play the game, which then serves as your menu and journal entries, which is a relatively unique way of handling these things. But again, it's relatively niche and appeals to a relatively small crowd. But that said, you can pick up Tunic for $30 full price, and it's available pretty much everywhere on every console, platform, etc. And it's absolutely worth a buy. If you can get it for less than $30, fantastic. But it's a fun game that's worth playing if you're interested. And then next up, we have one of the games where Souls-like as a genre get their names from, and that is Elden Ring. A company called From Software made all of your Dark Souls, Bloodborns, etc., and these games collectively became the genre known as Souls-likes. And while there have been many imitations and incorporations of their mechanics into other games, From Software's games are kind of the hallmark of the genre, and Elden Ring is a game from Software. Now, I highly doubt this video is the first time you're hearing about this game, but Elden Ring is an open world interpretation of that formula that previously hinged on very tight level design. And for the most part, a lot of that translated into Elden Ring incredibly well, making a deep game that has a variety of builds and playstyles available to you, though, like all of From Software's games and Souls-likes in general, the difficulty is really not for everyone. While Elden Ring is easily the easiest of these types of games, it is nonetheless a little obscure and it's going to make you work for your victory, which honestly just isn't for everyone. And while it can be an incredibly rewarding experience, if you're relatively new to gaming or buying this game for kids who just want to have a good time, Elden Ring and Souls-likes in general probably aren't the way I would go for that. But Elden Ring has a deep world, deep lore. It's easy to play through this game and not understand the story if you're not paying attention to environmental clues as well as text given through items. And because of all these things and the punishing combat, it's largely a game for more mature audiences, and you can pick it up on basically any platform or hardware that you have for $60. So it definitely gets a buy from me if you you like this genre, though it is admittedly not for everybody. Next up, we have another Souls-like known as Thymesia, which is a relatively recent release that sees us playing the role of a sort of plague doctor alchemist who is seeking to stop the spread of an infection around town. And compared to most Souls-likes, it has a very fast pace to the combat. There's a lot of emphasis on parrying and never letting up the attack, so it has a very fast pace to the combat overall. Though everything else about the game is pretty average for the most part, and unless you just really like the aesthetic, there's not a ton of reason to pick this game up over any other Souls-like, honestly. Though it is available on PlayStation 5, Nintendo Switch, Xbox Series X and S, and PC. And thankfully, it's rather cheap. It's only $25, which makes it easy to recommend, especially if you're just looking for something kind of cool to play around with. And while I don't think it's going to be a game a lot of people remember, it's still pretty fun and relatively cheap. And that brings us to Steelrising, the last of our Souls-likes to cover. Steelrising is an interesting take where we play as a dancing robot who actually becomes our fighter. So this particular game is an alternate take on the French Revolution that of course sees various automatons being developed and used. A lot of the story revolves around how that works out, but overall a pretty novel idea. Our character, Aegis, has a variety of playstyles available to her that we can use to both navigate and defeat enemies and automatons, as well as some cinematic boss fights, all while learning a little bit about the French Revolution, which is pretty cool. Overall, Steelrising is a really cool game that has a lot of accessibility options for this particular type of game, as again, this genre is known for being somewhat difficult. Steelrising has a lot of options that will let you customize the difficulty of it and exactly what you're having trouble with, or if you want to challenge yourself, which is one of the best things about this genre. Though Steelrising did have a few problems with optimization and running well on PC in particular at the time of its release. Though as far as Souls-likes go, it's a bit above average. This particular game is going to run you around 20 to 30 hours for one playthrough, depending on how long you play. And they're also currently working on things like New Game Plus and adding a little bit of content via DLC that just released. However, the main problem here is simply the asking price. They would like $50 for this game, and it is available on current generation consoles as well as PC. But the relatively limited scope of the game, combined with some of the issues around optimization, etc., make this mostly a buy on sale. $50 is a little much for this one, but if you can find it for cheaper than that, I think you can have a lot of fun with it. So something to keep in mind, certainly. And that brings us to action games. These are a little all over the place, honestly. They tend to, of course, focus on combat. That tends to be fast-paced and, of course, happening in real time. And we only saw a handful of these this year that are notable. Starting with the most recent release, we have Valkyrie Elysium, which is a sort of interesting entry into the Valkyrie series of games that sees us attempting to help Odin stop Ragnarok from happening, which mostly translates into hack and slash beat 'em ups with a variety of summons and elemental effects to combat. And the main thing this game has going for it is the combat. Unfortunately, it falls a little flat in most other regards. The story's okay, the art is pretty cool, and it has multiple endings, etc. But for the most part, it's just very average, honestly. You can have some fun smacking some things around. The difficulty settings also provide a challenge, as the Valkyrie difficulty can be quite challenging. And there's even some alternative game modes that were added in a free update recently. Though the main problem with this game is that they are asking for full price, $60 for a game that's going to run you about 15 hours, which makes it hard to justify the price, frankly. So it's available on PlayStation and PC, again, for $60. This is one I would recommend you get on a deep sale. You can have some fun with the combat, but definitely not $60 worth. And then next up, we have Soulstice. Soulstice is an interesting hack and slash that sees us taking on the role of Briar and Lute, a chimera, two people forged together, one dead and one living, to give them the powers to stop various corruption from spreading across the land. Overall, a very cool cinematic hack and slash, though it's worth mentioning this one does absolutely have some nudity in it. Nothing over the top by any means, and it's more part of the story than anything, but definitely something to keep in mind if you're buying this for somebody else. But we're going to be navigating a city that recently fell to corruption, of course, fighting all sorts of various monsters, etc., trying to stem the tide and close a portal. And while the combat is mostly pretty fun and hinges on you activating various fields to attack different types of enemies, with all sorts of upgrades and weapon types to be found along the way, it does stumble in some places, like the camera being a little difficult and unwieldy at times, and the color-coded enemies not exactly being everybody's taste. And while one run of the game will probably give you about 15 to 20 hours of playtime, the game does offer a decent amount of replayability, as the higher difficulties only unlock once you've beaten the game on lower difficulties, and there is a scoring system attached to a lot of the combat itself. So if you're looking for a fun hack and slash to kind of master, this could be a good option for you. It's available on modern generation consoles as well as PC for $40, and personally I would pick it up on sale, but depending on how much you want to play it, $40 isn't a terrible price either. Now that brings us to our narrative games. Narrative games are all about the story. You might take some various actions and situations, or there might even be combat to a degree, but all of it is typically handled through text and or skill checks. These games are often compared to choose-your-own-adventure books or referred to as visual novels, and this year we saw two in particular that I think are noteworthy. First up, we have Vampire the Masquerade Swansong, a game set around the World of Darkness and specifically the Vampire the Masquerade tabletop setting. Like most narrative games, it is of course relatively easy to follow, as you are basically just making decisions and hopefully keeping characters alive, and it's also relatively short. A playthrough is probably going to run you about 10 to 20 hours, and it's a fun romp through a vampire story, really. So if you like that, and you like in particular Vampire the Masquerade, I think it can be fun, and the story is relatively engaging with a lot of choices and variants. The real issue here is whether or not you want to pay $50 for it, because that's the full asking price, which is a lot for this type of game, especially one that suffered from some technical difficulties upon its launch. Now you can buy this on basically every platform, though you can't buy it through Steam, as this was an Epic exclusive and still is for the time being. Swansong, in my opinion, while it can certainly be a fun narrative game, simply is not worth $50. So if you can buy it on sale, you'll be in a good place, preferably around the $20 range, because that's about the amount of game you're getting. And then the other narrative game that I want to talk about actually just released. It is called Pentiment. It is a sort of historical romp through 16th century Bavaria, where we investigate a series of murders across 25 years. Like all narrative games, relatively point and click, we make some choices to define our character, as well as how we choose to investigate these murders. A playthrough is probably going to run you between 15 to 20 hours, and it is available on PC and Xbox for either $20, or it is available through its Game Pass subscription. And while I personally think this is a game that absolutely justifies its asking price, it's definitely not for everybody. Narrative games are inherently very niche, and Pentiment even more so, with its very specific focus on, again, 16th century Bavaria. But it's a game that oozes charm and well-researched history, so if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, I definitely think it's worth checking it out. And given its recent release, it's unlikely to go on sale. And that brings us to some open world games. This year did see a variety of just kind of general open world games that I didn't really think fit into any other category here, so I wanted to talk about them as their own thing. Though these games, of course, see us exploring a world, completing objectives, chasing down various collectibles, the usual stuff. This is a genre that can vary pretty wildly in look and feel, and could easily be part of or included in other genres here and there, and I've got 3 of them for you. We have Dying Light 2, the obvious follow-up to Dying Light, and where Dying Light is about the attempt at preventing a global zombie apocalypse, Dying Light 2 basically sees that apocalypse having happened and life adjusting to it. So while there are absolutely zombies to kill and fight, a lot of it focuses on the more human aspect of how people are coping in light of these things. It carries forth Dying Light's parkour system, however, we did lose the ability to use actual firearms, and honestly some of the tone was lost a little bit in translation as well. But Dying Light 2, like most open world games, is relatively easy to jump into. Basically you attack and fight zombies and the occasional person, as well as explore and parkour around the city with some fun navigational stuff. So it's not exactly a demanding game in terms of skill level. And in terms of hours spent, well, that's kind of a hot topic. So the game itself advertised that there was like 500 hours worth of content, which I don't think is true. Doing everything ran me about 110-ish. However, this is also a game that sees regular updates adding new content and activities, and while it's not exactly paid by any means, there are the occasional paid DLC, there is a lot of free content added at regular intervals, meaning that how much you get out of this game is widely up to you and how much you enjoy it. This game is available on modern consoles and PC, of course, and its full regular price is $60. And while I do think this game does have $60 worth of content, absolutely, the real issue here is that the game's kind of old already. This released back in February, I believe. So if you can buy it on sale, I would definitely look out for one, especially that we're going into the holidays and games like this would be on sale potentially. And if you haven't played it by this point, I'd probably just wait for a sale. Next up, we have Ghostwire Tokyo, a very unique game actually that released earlier this year that sees us as the lone survivor of a supernatural event in Tokyo, Japan. And we of course travel the city of Tokyo trying to unravel what happened and how we can fix it, whose lives we can save, all while taking in the absolute visual spectacle that is this game. Visually, this game is gorgeous. It's open world. It is a bit of a collectathon, honestly, though. The combat is relatively fun, if a bit simple. Like most open world games, this is an easy one to get into. And again, it is gorgeous. If you like Japanese mythology at all, you should absolutely check this one out. My only real complaint here is that much of the open world is empty, with a lot of things added to just kind of see you walking around collecting things with no real purpose in mind. The story itself is very cool. The setting is cool. Again, the game is beautiful. It's going to run you about 20 hours. It's available on PlayStation and PC, and full asking price is $60. $60, in my opinion, is a bit much for this. I think it's a great game, but the asking price is a little high, and because of that, I would buy this on sale. And if you can find a sale for it, preferably around the $20 to $30 range, then I would definitely check it out. You can have a good bit of fun with it. And that brings us to our last game in our sort of open world roundup section, and that is Elex 2, the sequel to Elex, of course, which continues the adventures of Jax in a post-apocalyptic world called Maglan, where a comet struck the world and brought the resource known as Elex, which can give people superpowers while stripping them of emotion. Well, in Elex 2, we find out that comet hit this planet intentionally as a sort of terraforming for an alien race who has come to settle. So much of this particular game sees us fighting and staving off this invasion of aliens in a continuation of the story from Elex. However, Elex 2 fails to do much of anything new, really. Elex 2 is almost identical to Elex. They expanded a couple of things in some minor ways. The combat feels a little better, the jetpack feels a little better, but much of the story is the same, while the game itself somehow looks a little worse, which makes it difficult to justify Elex 2's $50 asking price. And if that wasn't enough, Elex 2 is from Piranha Bytes, who are known for making a very particular type of RPG that can be a little bit demanding. And while Elex 2 is certainly easier than Elex, it is nonetheless a game that's difficult to just pick up and enjoy. You're probably going to have to mess around with it for a few hours to start feeling comfortable with it and understand how some of the systems work. However, once you do that, you can probably get around 40 to 50 hours out of it, and it's available on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. Now, for the most part, this is a buy on sale for me. I think they just kind of failed to deliver a compelling sequel here. It's too much copy and paste from the first game, and while they did expand a few things, it just wasn't enough. I would buy this one on sale. And from here, we have a handful of one-offs I would like to talk about. We saw one very interesting immersive sim game released this year, and this is Weird West, a very interesting supernatural Wild West game where we control ultimately a variety of characters, as this is a sort of anthology being told to you, where you'll control various characters under various circumstances in the Weird West. Some of which are werewolves, one is a pigman, each with unique abilities and a story to tell you. But in addition to that, if you're unfamiliar, Weird West is an immersive sim. That is an interesting thing. Basically, it means much of the world is interactable and there are layers of systems added to each other so you can stealth through, use items in creative ways, as well as engage in sort of interesting real-time combat. And the fact that Weird West is isometric makes it very unique in that regard. You don't exactly see a lot of isometric immersive sims. And since its release earlier this year, Weird West has been improving on a few things, adding additional modes to play the game with, which overall makes it a very interesting title that rewards creative thinking, honestly. The game itself is going to run you about 20 or so hours to see all of the stories, though you can get much more out of that depending on things like playing through the alternate game modes or just playing through it multiple times or exploring the world. And you can pick it up on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC for $40. This is a game that I think is absolutely worth the asking price, but if you can buy it on a sale for the holidays, even better, though it is absolutely worth $40. Then there is one notable roguelike that I wanted to mention, which are interesting games that revolve around a certain amount of procedural generation where you'll often die repeatedly, grow stronger, try again, that kind of thing. But Cult of the Lamb sees us taking on the role of a lamb who starts a cult. We are sacrificed on an altar at the beginning of the game only to be saved by a sort of eldritch power who names us the herald for their cult. We build up our cult to gain revenge on the people who sacrificed us, all while running around as a cute, adorable lamb. Very interesting game, very easy to play, relatively easy systems. Roguelike in nature, so we're going to be moving through procedural sections of map as we attempt to get towards various bosses. The combat is interesting, especially with these boss fights, though it's a relatively small in scope game. To see all the content, you're probably looking at around 15 or so hours. And while the game is available on pretty much every platform, it is best played with a controller, and it's easily one of the best indie games to come out this year. It's also available for $25, which makes it a very easy buy, though it is worth mentioning that in spite of the cutesy graphics, obviously some of the subject matter is a little mature. So I would watch out buying this for young children thinking it's a game about farm animals or something. But beyond that, ton of fun. And then we have one notable CRPG that actually released this year, and it is called Black Geyser. Black Geyser sees us taking on the role of a variety of characters, of course, one made by ourselves and then potentially several companions, as we navigate the world of Yerangol, which sees multiple warring factions, of course, as a curse of greed spreads across the land, and your actions as a party can affect and either increase or decrease the greed, which affects all sorts of things like the general attitude and behavior of townsfolk and NPCs. And overall, it's a pretty interesting game with a unique story to tell, and it's being updated all the time, actually. There's a planned update right now that will actually allow you to make an entire party of heroes, as opposed to just your main character and then using companions. And it's a game that has steadily improved since its launch, as CRPGs tend to be very complicated. And like most CRPGs, this one takes some dedication to get into, and it's probably going to run you about 40 to 50 hours should you choose to play it, but I do think it's worth your time. Full price, this normally is $30, but you can regularly get it on sale. I think it's on sale right now for like $20 actually, and it's available on PC only. But if you like games like Baldur's Gate, etc., it's worth checking out, though I doubt it will live up to quite those games for you. And that leaves us with our one game that I simply would not recommend you buy that did release this year, and this is a game called The Waylanders. If you see this anywhere, I would stay away from it, frankly. Unfortunately, the game did not sell well on launch, thanks to a variety of bugs that made the game almost unplayable. Technically, you could complete it, but it was a real hassle. And unfortunately, the game was abandoned thereafter, so it is unlikely to be fixed at any point. And while the marketing material and the Steam page or information about it on various platforms can seem pretty interesting, it is unfortunately just a game that isn't really playable in its current state and is unlikely to be fixed ever, so I would just not buy this, period. Which is a shame because a lot of the ideas at play were interesting, albeit very poorly executed, full of bugs. And that finally brings us to our unreleased section of the video. Currently, as I'm recording this, we are on the tail end of December, just before Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, all the usual deal times. However, there are still several games releasing this year that I think are worth keeping in mind, and while obviously I can't give extended thoughts about them, I can give you a little bit of general information. So, first up we have Evil West. Evil West is another Supernatural Wild West game coming out on November 22nd, so just a few days from the time this video is actually releasing, and it'll be available on PlayStation, Xbox, as well as PC. This particular game is more of an action-focused game though, third person, and and we're going to be attempting to eradicate some vampire threats in the Wild West, of course. Definitely an interesting premise, worth keeping an eye on. Hard to say what it's going to be worth, though. And then on December 2nd, we actually have 2 games releasing on the same day, and this is the Callisto Protocol and Marvel's Midnight Suns. The Callisto Protocol promises to be a next-generation horror game where we play someone trapped in a penal colony in space trying to survive some nightmarish horrors, and it will also be available on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC, and it's definitely one of the more anticipated December releases, so something to keep an eye on for sure, though obviously being a horror game, not going to be for everybody. Then we have Marvel's Midnight Suns. This is a superhero-based tactical turn-based game where we will play various superheroes from the Marvel universe, albeit with a slightly darker spin and, using the Midnight Sun stuff. And while this is a tactical turn-based game, it will be using card-based mechanics. Though the game is not released yet, we have seen some early previews of this one, and the reaction seems to be mixed. Honestly, though, I imagine kids especially that enjoy Marvel will probably like this a great deal, and using the brand power of Marvel anyway, it will likely do well regardless of how good the game actually is, though there's still a lot of questions and things up in the air on that particular one. And then we have High on Life from the creators of the Rick and Morty series. This game sees us fighting off an alien cartel that is using humans as drugs. Somehow these aliens have used human beings and turned them into some sort of drug, which is a pretty bizarre premise in and of itself, but from the creators of Rick and Morty, that is hardly a surprise. This is going to be a first-person shooter of sorts where we're going to be playing around with various talking guns, and it seems like it's a game that is going to be very much so on the mature side of ridiculous humor. And it's certainly shaping up to be one of the more interesting titles of the year, if nothing else. It will be coming to Xbox and PC this December. Now, last but not least, we have a few titles that are highly praised, but I have not personally checked out. First and foremost, we of course have God of War Ragnarok, which is a follow-up to 2018's God of War, continuing, of course, the story of Kratos and his son Atreus. This game released earlier this month to critical acclaim, though it is available only on PlayStation at the moment, as it was an exclusive. So for those of you who own a PlayStation who want to check this out, obviously a safe bet, and I imagine it will be one of the bigger titles of the holidays period. And then last but not least on our long list of games here, we have Stray. Stray is a game where you play as a cat. It's available on PlayStation as well as PC, and it's a relatively simple exploration game where, again, you just roleplay as a cat. You go around doing cat stuff in a sort of weird post-apocalyptic world full of all sorts of robots, but overall a very unique title that released to critical acclaim earlier this year in July, though I imagine how much you like this will really come down to how much you like cats. But nonetheless, pretty cool game. But that, guys, is going to do it for our 2022 Holiday Buyer's Guide. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. We covered a ton of games here, tried to give everybody as much information on them as I possibly could, but that said, this is the first time I've done a guide like this, so I'm absolutely open to feedback or suggestions down in the comments section below, so by all means hit me with your feedback below, and if you have any further questions, just again, ask in the comments section, and I'm sure myself or many others will be happy to answer you. All of that said, truly thank you for watching this incredibly long video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it helps you make a few purchasing decisions on RPGs this holiday season. But regardless of all that, truly, thank you so much for watching. Happy holidays. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.